Okay.
So we're starting with Clark County. It began after the Lewis and Clark, and while U.S. Census don't record anybody in the Northwest until, of course, after the Lewis and Clark, people were here. There weren't good records of Native Americans. The next big push was John Jacob Astor came through here and developed Astoria. He didn't really stop there. Then there was the Hudson Bay Company presence, about 1823. And people died, and they buried him. They buried him around the old Fort Vancouver, which wasn't a military fort, it was a commercial enterprise. It was a business. And apparently in those days, once you were dead, you were dust. And they didn't keep those places well. Save for the Catholic Church, they spent a little more effort in burying people. And there were lots of Catholics among the Hudson Bay folks, because there were a lot of French Canadians. And in those days, it was a very diverse group. There were lots of natives. There were the Scotch and the English, who, like McGoffin, and the French Canadians, who were the fur traders and brought things with the Indians, all that going on. So about 1850, there is a U.S. Census, but it was not Washington. It was still Oregon Territory. And by that time, the U.S. Army arrived, took a huge swath of property and claimed it, and neatly evicted the Hudson Bay Company as it were. And there was a lot of burial confusion. I'm sorry, Stephen, he's not happy. Go away. It's the car. Yeah, the car. We can't have it.
Should have filmed up there.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're getting to the 1850s. Oregon is a U.S. Census of Clark County, Oregon, says there were about 1,200 people. Between 1850 and 1860, you'll see a huge change in Clark County population. It became Clark County, Washington. They had figured out the difference between Oregon and Washington and Canada, and people who arrived here were people like the Knights. So we're going up this way in this first row, sir, and we're going to look at the Knight Whitmer. Joel and Amelia are, in my world, in my view, emblematic of the type of people that came to the Northwest. They weren't escaping something horrible. They were seeking something better. Joel Knight was a doctor. He was born in England. He arrived in Massachusetts with his dad. He met Amelia. She came from a Boston family. She was an educated young woman, highly marriageable woman. She got a doctor. They married and they moved to Iowa. They were there about 11 years. Iowa they did well in Iowa, but Joel had asthma, allergy, and whatever the abundant growth in that area had bothered him. So they heard about the Northwest and they packed up and went. They had 2 wagons. They hired drovers. They brought cattle. They brought money. Amelia was pregnant. She also wrote a journal, an entry every day of that 3 or 4 month trip during the whole journey. They arrived on the south side of the Columbia River in, of course, Oregon, about Milwaukee. There was somebody's farm that welcomed them. She birthed her youngest child, and the next day, her husband had the raft and the wagons loaded up. They crossed the river, and I don't know, there must have been a real estate agent waiting in Camas because they had a house and land immediately. So to me, they're emblematic of the kind of pioneer stock in that decade that arrived in Clark County. These were people seeking a better life. We're there to Whitley because one of the Knight daughters married Jacob Josiah Whitler, and they had 6 children before she died.
Must have been Lucy.
Yeah, no, this is Lucy. She died in, get a good number here.
It says wife of J. Whitler.
Yeah, that's the one. Age 31. She married she married John Jacob Whitler. He married a second wife and had more children. She died at 31. They had, I believe, 6 children together. But in 1871, this was a very new cemetery, and it was a reflection because the history of this cemetery is that it was about 1869 that they opened this area. Somebody donated. There was a donation in 1867, and the graves were moved from the post. So it is a real change of attitude about cemeteries. And I think because the people came from a great number of English, New England, doesn't mean everybody came from New England, but there was that idea that burial was important and how they looked was important, because Mount Auburn Cemetery outside of Boston was the first garden rural cemetery. They landscaped Mount Auburn. To this day, it's still a very lovely garden destination. You know, I understand they plant tulips and daffodils. They have huge hillsides there. Mount Auburn Cemetery, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. So Waterford. It's about 4 miles west of Boston. It's a destination. But people buried here, the idea of being on the side of a cemetery or a post, a military post, was not appealing, I think, obviously, to the gentry of Clark County. Because these people, the Whitlers were fairly prosperous and ambitious people. They were active in the town of Vancouver. Amelia and Joel are buried in the night cemetery. So in the library, we've got the Knight family cemetery. It really sounds like it was on the original land property. Yeah.
Go.
He said go.
Go, thank you. Gustav died in 1881. He was a German immigrant. And can you hear me? Thank you. He was a German immigrant along with his wife Augusta. They do appear in New York State on 1850 census records. They married in 1853 in New York. Their son Rudolph, right here, was born in New York in 1855. They then migrated, but U.S. Census in Washington Territory, 1860, only shows Gustav. What I found interesting about that is Gustav said he had like $2,000 worth of property. A guy who just gets on a wagon train and comes west has property on a census. I thought that was notable. And I wanted to know more about this family. He was one of the blacksmiths in the community. I have done research, and again, these one of the pioneers that had they had means, they had ambition, they wanted to live, a successful, better life. They were very involved in the community. They have 4 children. All their daughters were born in Washington. Of course, Rudolph was born in New York. None of their daughters married. One daughter died in infancy. The other 2 daughters lived in the community and became teachers. Both the daughters lived with their mother in downtown Vancouver after their father died. And Augusta, Mrs. Ebert, died in 1917. And I'm not sure if she has a separate stone or she's buried with me. I think that 2 things are very interesting about the Ebert. Number one, Gustav was involved with the community. He was the blacksmith. And the community, they were very social, and I felt like they were upwards. They were all wanting to live a good life. And in the Vancouver Independence, in August of 1870, there was a report of an accident incident. And I quote, "Returning from the campground Sunday evening and Monday morning, accidents seemed to be in order. The wagon in which Mr. Ebert and family were riding was overturned, but no damage of any consequence resulted. One of Brandt's buggies and one of Smith's was somewhat used up by the breaking of springs. The blacksmith gets a job and nobody is hurt. Let us be thankful." That's the kind of thing that's in the paper. The other thing about Adolf being community-minded is in 1876, there was a commission of parties of men in Vancouver who decided that there should be tree dedicated in the public square of Vancouver to commemorate our centennial. They thought themselves Americans and part of the United States. They weren't a state until '89. But in 1877, January 6th, an article about centennial trees. This is very grateful. So the committee got together and they decided that in the public square, a commemoration of the first 100 years of our country should be marked. And after they decided they were going to do it, a circle was drawn 240 feet in circumference, and the trees set out in the shape of 5 pointed stars, with the trees representing the points were 2 red oaks, 2 white elms, and 1 ash leaf maple. The center of the star was represented by that fine tree, the ailanthus, which is a tree of heaven, which is now considered a pet. Invasive species.
Oh, that's funny.
Yes. Under this tree was placed a fruit bottle enclosed in a small jar in which were placed the pictures of Hayes, Wheeler, Tilden, and Hendricks, a copy of the Daily Oregonian, a copy of the City Charter of Vancouver, and sundry other things too numerous to mention. And Gustav Ebert's name appeared.
So it was a time capsule.
A bit of a time capsule. And I want you to know that inquiring minds want to know where this city plaza, because I found nothing that talked about a city plaza in Vancouver until, where was I? And somebody said, oh yeah, Esther Short talked about that. I think I might have been the daughters. And I looked up Esther Short, and indeed, she donated the park that we still have, but that was where the plaza was, the city plaza. The Plaza Square of Vancouver. And here's what I want to show you that Steve did for us. If you go to Esther Short Park, like Steve and I did, and here's the playground, and see this concrete?
Uh-huh. Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
That's 240 feet. That's the plaza. And there are trees planted around here.
That's right, Island Park.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I wonder if the time capsule's still there.
I don't know. I'm thinking this has to be something that maybe we could ask, but there's the farmer's market, and there's all the good stuff. The tree of heaven wouldn't live this long, so this is more than 100 years. But the red maples, their longevity, they could have lived this long. So when Steve and I went and marched this off, what we realized was I couldn't tell what trees looked like because they were bare root. These were all deciduous trees, not bare root. They were no leaves. I couldn't read the leaves. Barely. There were no leaves to read.
Yeah.
So our heritage tree. So I just brought up the stuff. If people are interested I gave you trees. I found this. If you're interested in trees and you want to know what a tree is in the early spring, there are 2 kinds of trees. Evergreen conifer firs. Evergreen conifers, since they're not all firs, or deciduous. So that's a deciduous tree up there. Those great big ones, that is a conifer, an evergreen conifer. There is one conifer that is deciduous. It's called a larch, and it loses its leaves or needles in the winter. But if you're a tree, you become a tree geek. I found this, and it will tell you if you're not, you don't remember what you planted, it will tell you when they bud out in the early spring what kind of tree you have.
And that link is on.
No, that isn't here. Well, I'll make a copy of that. I just found that. I'll make a copy of that for you. I'll mail it to you. So that brings us around to the Ebert family, and Rudolph was a surgeon, and he served at Fort Vancouver. And when his mother died in 1917, he was in Hawaii, and the family waited. Of all the Eberts in Clark County, they are all descended from first Gustav, then Rudolph. He had 4 sons. I think Fred. Lawrence, I know, is one. Now, the question to you is, Betty thought she might come today, and she lived next door to Sandra. And I was telling Richard Inkster that I knew descendant neighbor was a descendant. And Lawrence died, and Richard has been doing cemetery research on the Eberts, as he has on a lot of families that isn't even published yet. And he doesn't know where he died. And so when I told him I knew that Betty, he said, oh, maybe she knows. He died a bachelor. So Richard said, I know when he died. Let's see if it says on here. Can we go walk over here, Steve? He was the son of Rudolph. He was a first lieutenant in the Army. He was born in 1880. He died in 1961. So we knew that. Didn't say where he died.
Which Ebert was it that was the surgeon?
Rudolph. His wife is not here, Tabitha. And Betty gave me the cookbook that Sandy Ebert Ruff is in here. And Sandy gave us this recipe when we were having an open house at the Genie Society. And I didn't know where it came from. This is the one. And she said, Tabitha Alice Clark Ebert. Tabitha was born in Portland, but she died in Berkeley. And I think she died after Rudolph died. Yeah, Berkeley, California. And we don't know where she's buried. She's not buried here. So another question. But while we're on Rudolph, one of the resources we have in our county at the museum, here's Rudolph. Yeah. That was one of the pictures in the photo archive at the museum. And this must have been some sort of Grand Army something. And he's one of these guys.
Would these be Union?
Yeah, he was a United States Army surgeon. Yeah, for sure.
But with these
were all, there was no identification of who these people were.
I mean, from your knowledge of Union uniforms, does that look like?
No, it was like a military retirement group, or a reserve group, or they had the Army of the Grand Old Army of the Republic after the Civil War, and they all met like at reunions. They did.
They would have been Union.
Yes, most of them were Union, but he also continued serving for the U.S. Army, so that was that. But I think this is at the gazebo at the, it looks like they're at the port. So, which cricket? I think that's him right there. I think it's this corner one. Yeah. Could be. His beard looks shorter there. Anyway, these were in the photo archives. The Eberts continue in Clark County.
Is that photo archives like a historical museum?
When you put in the newspaper archives, there are like 150 newspaper articles in the Independence, Vancouver Independence.
Can you search by surname?
Yeah,
Yeah, do that.
it's there were other Eberts that were related. So it goes. Okay. One more mission on trees. Now, since the Eberts started in 1876, but as we all know, Vancouver is known as the city of trees. But in 1997, they started the Heritage Tree Program. And we've got a whole list of trees all over Vancouver. Those 3 newly leafing out trees are heritage trees, and they are fraxinus. They're called fraxinus, which is
what? Fraxinus?
Yeah. Give you the common name.
Never heard of that.
Ash. They are ash trees.
So
They are.
that one that's in between these two, is that
They are
the same
right
thing?
on the fence line. Can you see
three
the
on
tops of
that are
them?
kind of yellow looking?
Yes. See the tops
I only
of
see 2 that are the same. You said
Oh,
there
there's
were
one in the
3.
middle. Yeah. They're all kind of interlap. And on the
Oh, I see now. Okay.
the south side, they have plaques. They're vague about it. Because they only started memorializing heritage trees in 1997.
Educated guess.
Yeah, it's an educated guess.
Right.
So the other tree that these grave sites. This is Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bilbreth, and they have a nice monument. And as far as I can tell, and I did ask Richard, we don't know if they have any living descendants here. We couldn't find him. They weren't here. They weren't here in the really pioneer times, but he came here later. We think about 1880, 1890s, and he married Ellen, who was his second wife. And we can't find any children. They're not in the pioneer book. But what I came to ask questions about, as inquiring minds want to know more, is this holly tree. What kind of holly is it? Is she looking for a husband?
Yeah. She'll be back.
She'll be back?
Yeah.
Let me find. Who knows? The podium is kind of short here. Connection of trees and pioneers here. These are early, this is an early family, obviously. Here we go. But here's a holly tree. And here's Charles, but CW. And there's the headstone for Ellen. Ellen died in 1899.
That one that's all sideways?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Well, she's written, go look on the other side. She's written on the tall monument. And CW has a little head, you know, I think they call that footstones. See the little one? So they have this whole area. CW and Ellen, and then they have the entire monument. So when I came in, I drove down here and I'm going, wow, look at that holly tree. So I looked them up. He died in 1907. So I am surmising that Ellen passed away. It was his second wife. He didn't marry a third time. And he planted a charming gallon-sized planter of a holly, from a nursery. And I believe in 1899 that Clark County was an urban enough community that folks were buying plants. So the question is, what kind of holly is this? So the story of holly in the Pacific Northwest became holly was discovered and imported to the Northwest, especially to growers in Oregon, because everybody liked holly wreaths at Christmas. And these entrepreneurs went to England and they just admired the holly in England, English holly specifically. And they consulted with the horticultural guys. Oh yeah, it grows wonderfully well. Yes, it propagates nicely. Yes. And so the enterprising horticulturalists started producing holly, and they became wealthy, and they would chop up holly and sell it at Christmas. Had people planting it all over the Northwest. There were pots of it, and I would say the horticultural business in the Northwest thrived because everything grows here. The Willamette Valley is one of the most prolific gardens. In fact, in Oregon, the number one agricultural crop is landscape. It's not wheat or any of that. So Oregon and the Northwest, so they're thriving. So I'm thinking, in whatever you may concur, is here is a grieving man. He gets this holly that also has symbolic meaning in the plant world, and puts it next to his beloved wife Ellen's footstone or headstone, the small head name marker. But here it is, more than 100 years later, and it's pushing over this monument, which it looks like it's granite. I don't think it's concrete. Granite.
Yeah, it's granite.
Here's the thing. If this is truly an English holly, its lifespan is about 100 years. And we could measure this and take dimensions and get it. But I'm guessing because of the headstone. If one of the Philbrook children, and it would have been his first family, might have buried him and added it, it would have been 1907. Still, that would make this more than 100 years old. And it's kind of, it's a huge old specimen. The cool thing is the American holly is very similar in texture and shiny leaves to the English holly. So I thought, well, maybe it's an American. Everything grows here. Maybe it just grew here. And somebody went up and got it out of the woods. Well, no. American holly are indigenous only east of Mississippi. They aren't here naturally. So it's more likely English. So the bottom line to my whole horticultural foray into which is which is it's likely English holly and not American. And the odd thing that our indigenous American holly shouldn't be here because it is a slower growing holly. It doesn't freely reseed like this one does. And it has about a 200-year lifespan. The trouble with English holly, it is now on the Washington State invasive species because see all this pollen? Well, it reseeds and it is invasive to our native plants. And when
you mean the ivy?
No, the holly.
Oh, but the ivy is on the invasive list too.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Got that right. So I don't think the Philbrecks have descendants here, and I think the idea of having a steward for cemeteries to help this, because if I came out here as a gardener, I certainly would take all that out.
I would too. Yeah.
And the thing is, other hollies are around here, and hollies need a male and female to pollinate each other, and there's hollies all around.
Oh, this looks like it's having a problem with that.
You're right.
Now those suckers need to be cut out too.
All of it. Yeah.
This is some kind of ground cover. Is that native?
It's kind of like a violet.
It is.
Okay, we got another heritage tree.
It's what?
Quercus prinus.
Hmm?
All oaks are in the Latin botanical name Quercus. It's a chestnut oak.
We're talking this one right here.
That
Right.
big one. That's a different something oak to the left. So when this was designated, it was about 85 feet tall and 85 spread. And a spread is all the leaves. The girth will be like the trunk when we're talking about that. So it's heritage tree number 24. Says it was native to the Appalachian region. This tree was sent as a seedling from George Washington Plantation, Mount Vernon, as a gift to the local free and accepting Mason Squad number 4. And so I believe this is the whole Mason area in here, so that's why it's here. And implanted in 1931 to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the lodge. And oh, I'm right, the tree is located in the Mason section now. There we are. The tree botanically is also known as the rock oak or basket oak, valued for its bark, which is richer in tannin acid more than any other of the oaks, making it useful in tanning of leather. So, you know, if a pioneer out here had planted it, that would probably be why they did. But since it was planted in 1931, that was just kind of an ongoing cool place to make this a a nice destination cemetery. So the other trees of interest on the heritage list, I showed, we had the picture that Steve found for us of the circle at Esther Short Park. The grove of all the conifers are considered heritage trees as a group because they've all been growing there for a long time. They're considered a grove. And a grove horticulturally is kind of an important designation because trees sort of support each other.
Mm-hmm.
And now science saying, trees sometimes talk to each other somehow,
Mm-hmm.
and help, in various ways, by roots, by whatever. Maybe we don't know their language completely.
The Wizard of Oz was right. The movie,
Probably.
they trees talk to each other.
I feel goofy sometimes, but I hate to see a tree chopped down because I think they cry.
Oh.
But when you look at them, when you cut down a tree, the sap runs freely. That makes me feel like they cry. Anyway,
Don't come to my house.
don't come to my house, man. Well,
We're cutting down our trees.
well,
It's a black walnut tree. It's a nightmare. Are they busy?
no,
No.
it's just there are reasons. I understand. And that's a whole other topic of pruning and cutting out trees, of putting in the right kind of tree in the right place and having a lot of knowledge. But the two other interesting groups on the heritage list that you could go between here and downtown is Officers Row. All the trees on Officers Row on both sides are designated as a heritage tree as a group. In the list, they don't list what kind of trees. So when you drive down there, you will see both evergreen, conifers, and deciduous trees on both sides of Officers Row on Evergreen. There is also a Mayor's Grove, which is at north of, it's on Mill Plain in the park there north. What's it? That's not Persons, Marshall. The Marshall Center, that whole park around there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the south side of that, closer to Mill Plain, there's a grove of mayor's trees, and the first Arbor Day of a new mayor, he plants a tree of his choice in the Arbor Day mayor's tree. It's not quite a grove because the trees, I guess, are rather different. But again, in the heritage list brochure, they're not individually listed, so you have to go and look at them. So, kept you out here.
That one that's blooming over there under, I think those are maples. What is that one, do you know?
I don't know, we'd have to go look closer. It's a blooming something.
Yeah, it's very pretty.
It's a blooming something.
Hey, even I knew that, Marcia.
We start with what we know, Sherry. I know. Dendrophile.
What's a dendrophile?
I just told
Tree
you.
hugger.
Tree hugger.
I love trees. It's a person who loves trees.
Mm.
And you know what? I looked that up. I thought it was an arborophile.
That's what I would have called it. Yeah.
And it's not. Arborophile is a non-existent word.
What is that? That looks kind of like a date or a cedar, but is it a cedar?
No.
Another ID, tree ID we need.
Mm-hmm.
A fir